Hello everybody. Every one of these plants that you can see here is 3,600 plants per plant, or a minimum of 400 plants per plant expansion rate. Look at the cattle. Look at the little faces of the animals. This is what we suffer and what's illegal, and our state government allows this to happen. So sit back, enjoy your time, and watch the story as it unfolds. Hello everybody, Gary from Lantana Removal Queensland. Back at you in the first day of 2019. So here we are, and let's get started. Yesterday I did some filming on New Year's Eve and went and took down a lot of important documentation and photos and things like that, which was really rewarding. I really enjoyed the day. Anyway, I got a little bit of a croaky throat. Anyway, so one of the things that came out, so we've got the Lantana best practices manual, and you guys know I'm not a big fan from the stuff that's written in there is so incorrect. Machinery that are documented and used are 30-40 years old. So anyway, but what did come of that is that by my proving that seeds float in water, it's changed the actual whole way we think about Lantana completely, in the way that it moves. So I also wrote not long before that to the Department of Environment in New South Wales. Can't remember what it came up on, but I think it was under the Lantana Camera stuff, something that was supplied to me by a friend. Anyway, I asked some questions, so I got a response back, and it was quite interesting how the response came back. It says, "Dear Gary, the EPA/OEH is not the appropriate government agency to address your concerns about control and management of Lantana camera." So, it's not very promising by that line. But then it says, far from this weed being dismissed as not important, it is listed as a weed of national significance and is regarded as one of the worst weeds in Australia because of its invasiveness. Now that's interesting, because this lady is saying that this material still holds that ranking and still is thought of in exactly the same way, and yet we find councils allowing it to grow all down the sides of roads. And remember that too, main roads TMR is responsible for major highways and major roads. Councils are responsible for everything else, okay, all of the rest of the roads. And even where those materials are growing on the sides of highways, TMR doesn't have any operational works in that stuff, so they're supposed to subcontract that work back to the councils on the guise of saying, well, it's a shared responsibility, we both have important similar interests in that particular areas, so it suits to get the council to do the work. Now when you front the councils all say, well, we don't do any Lantana work, Lantana's off the list, there's no money for Lantana, and Lantana's not being touched. So you're back to saying, well, hold on a minute, that doesn't actually read true to what's happening in the real world. And many people in New South Wales are saying exactly that with their land holdings and things along the sides of roads that are infesting their properties. So, worst weeds in Australia because of its invasiveness, potential for spread, which is absolutely massive, and economic and environmental impacts. Now, so within this document, they actually list all of those particular things that the Anastasia Palaszczuk government says they're not important in Queensland. So additionally, when the scientific committee identifies the spread of this weed as a key threatening process, it means that for the species affected, it is a very significant threat which may lead to the extinction of that listed threatened species. Now that's something we need to be very careful of in our nation, and it's what I've told you before, is that we only have about 2% of our nation that's actually protected. The 98% is completely written off. Now the government hasn't told you all of that because they don't want to create mass hysteria and have people go, oh my God, why would I buy land when I purchase the land, I have no rights to any of the assets on the land. I have no rights to protect the land. Okay? So realistically, under the Anastasia Palaszczuk government and the New South Wales government, you're buying a liability. There's no other way to look at it. You can't protect it, you can't look after it, and you're signing off on it's worth this amount of money. Now, we're finding through places, you know, all across our state, through Burner, through Lockyer Valley, that places are selling for half of their property value because they've got lantana on them. Some of them not as big infestations as you think, but they're selling for half of their property value across our state. And again, our Premier says, not a problem, don't worry about it. So if you buy a block of land, and it's $1 million, say, just picking figures, and it's actually physically only worth $500,000, when the bank comes to foreclose or you go to sell and it's only worth half of the value you paid, who wears the cost of that? See, I maintain that through this process with the next elections and the Premier and the councils, they should be forced to actually disclose to you whether in your local neighbourhood they are going to protect your rights and protect you against these weeds. And if the answer comes back no, or we're not willing to tell you, you need to think about what you're buying into. Because with these councils like Moreton Bay Regional Council, we have millions and millions and millions. Well, no, it'd be $1 billion problem, at least throughout our whole shire. And yet there is no money for it. Now, the council actually represents you, the public. So the council's job is when I go to them and I say, this is a problem and I want this material cleaned up, which it's illegal to release it to the environment, then it's the council's responsibility to take those things to the state government and collect the funding. Now, I can't say strongly enough, in 2019, we will be holding community meetings within council chambers at all councils, even New South Wales, and we will demand that they abide by the law that says you cannot release this material to the environment. That's it. In that meeting at the Scenic Rim Council, okay, biosecurity admits that if you have lantana spreading across your property, that constitutes a breach of your biosecurity, general biosecurity obligations, and that means that it's enforceable. They defined it. It's on tape. They defined it as enforceable. They defined it that we would take out a breach notice and we would force the subject to comply. Failure to comply would mean that we would send in the council would do the work, and then the resident would be taken to court for the costs and those costs attached to their rates. So the government has seen all of these issues as serious enough for them to have put all these things in place that they can recuperate their money. And yet you can see documents after documents after documents where it actually says the state government is actually as responsible or even more responsible than you are. And yet, again, the Premier pretends that this doesn't exist. They are operating outside of the law and pretending that's okay. Now, we cannot afford in the future to allow this to continue, because not only will those prices fall by half, but they'll fall by a lot more than that as people start to realise exactly how invasive lantana is. So it is regarded as a WANS, so weeds of national significance, because it forms dense, impenetrable thickets that take over native bushland and pastures on the east coast of Australia. It competes for resources with and reduces the productivity of pastures and forestry plantations, and it adds fuel to fires and is toxic to stock, and it is toxic to humans. It is on record as having killed people in our nation, children and adults, where they have consumed the berries. Now, they say to you that the birds eat the berries and fly the berries to the top of the hill and poop them out, and that starts the infestations, and that's all well and good, but the birds die. Okay, it's deadly to them the same as it's deadly to us. Until somebody proves differently, and No scientific studies have been done on that stuff. It's worthless to do it. I don't want to stick a bird in a cage and feed it berries until it dies. Okay, but let's not sugarcoat this and say that this is okay. These materials are seeding and germinating all year round because our government is allowing these materials to grow on the sides of roads. Areas that, in our test areas, they've seeded already 5 times in the last 3 months due to the water coming off the roads. So within that cycle, they're way ahead of 6 times in a year that I allowed, and 6 times in a year gives you 3,600 new plants for every plant, and they are way in front of that, and we haven't even gotten through the rest of the summer months. So we have major problems coming up with these things. Okay, it is also recognised as a serious threat to biodiversity in several World Heritage listed areas, including the wet tropics of North Queensland, Fraser Island, where we showed you those photos of the four-wheel drive group winching out the Lantana, doing a massive job for National Parks and Wildlife Service, and the Greater Blue Mountains. Numerous plants and animal species of conservation significance are threatened. I tell you, that makes me absolutely wild to read that phrase, okay? Because the people who handle all of the wildlife issues, okay, I have a real bone to pick with that group, with all those groups, okay? They're run not-for-profits, and yes, they have the state government standing on their throat and controlling what they think, what they say, what they do. And the situation is, if you said there were 10 animals per hectare of land, okay, when you multiply that out by the 10 million hectares, you end up with 100 million animals, homeless or dead. And not one of these organisations has said a word about the government's Lantana. Now it's 14 million hectares. That's 140 million animals, homeless or dead. Most of them are dead. You look at the North Queensland bushfires, where the Lantana links the canopy from the ground to the canopy of the trees and created canopy fires and just absolutely burned alive all of the koalas and all of the other animals that climb for a living to get away from the fires. And then it came back through at ground level and killed all the cattle and killed everything else at ground level. And our Premier has the absolute disgraceful hide to claim that it's global warming has something to do with this. It has to do with the billions of tons of Lantana you have sitting at the bottoms of those trees. That's what it has to do with. Your illegal operations of allowing that material to prosper and to exist. Remember this, in a bad area, Lantana expands by 400 plants. That's according to their scientific data. It expands by 400 plants per plant. Now that would be a bad day. That would be a very, very bad day. And a very good reason why Lantana can never be allowed to exist and to keep taking over our lands. Why lie to the public? Why rob them of the ability to be able to realise that the more they let this material grow on their lands, the higher the cost is to them. Even their book says that one of the greatest costs in Lantana is the rehabilitation costs after you allow it to establish. They tell you they know that. Then why do they leave it for year after year after year, 20 years growing in places where Lantana is the only thing in those areas? That's why all this garbage that's circulated by people who often are linked to the government says, oh, well, you know, I got this fake Facebook account, it's got no photo on it, or it's got this or it's got that. But, you know, we don't want to clear the Lantana too quickly because the little birdies will have nowhere to live. I'm of Indigenous heritage and proud of it. And I've spent my life tracking and enjoying following animals and different signs. And I can tell you from my experience, 40 years in the cabin and the machinery, removing and eradicating this material permanently, that there's nothing living under this Lantana. When it's in a full-blown thicket, there is nothing living under this material. Blind Freddy, you do not have to be a black tracker to look at that material and go, nothing has moved those leaves under those under those vegetations at all in years. It's a disgrace. Yet these people come through and they say, oh, no, something might use it. Do you know something really interesting? Those animals would have lived somewhere before that Lantana took over and decimated those ecologies. Those same people are allowing this material to grow in riparian zones. And they even turn around and say, oh, well, it's good because it stops cattle from getting to water. This is how small-minded their minds are. And this makes sense to these people. And they then post that to Facebook, and other people look at it and go, oh yeah, well that's right, because they might damage the embankment. They might damage something to do with getting at water. The insanity of it. So a native animal getting to water is going to cause less or more damage, or the same damage, or what? Now you've got animals can't get access to water, and Mr. and Mrs. whatever they are saying that's a good thing. The trouble is, when we have Lantana then having access to those water resources, it starts to spread at 3,600 plants per plant, or more. Or more. That's the trouble with these things. We have enormous expansion rates of these materials, and it's illegal. The biosecurity says that that's illegal for that material to be expanding across those surfaces. And that's interesting because another section of the community, which is government, says that, oh, well, it only counts if it's spreading to new lands. Look at how big the lies have been to you in just the last couple of years. That it increased from 10 million hectares. So they increased it in 2009 from 5 million hectares to 2018 to 10 million hectares. But this is compounding interest. It doesn't expand by one. It's expanding by 400 or 3,600. And now we have enormous amounts of these plants growing in these areas, okay, because the government officials know nothing about the concept of this. Our ecology has changed, that these plants are growing on the sides of the roads and then expanding by 3,600 plants, every single plant. They're seeding and blossoming and growing berries at times of the year when there aren't very many other food sources for the birds and the other animals. So these guys are eating this material at odd times of the year and then flying it to the top of the hilltops. And then when it comes back down off those surfaces, it's being pushed by water. And that then has the consequence of accelerating and increasing the zone of influence of those materials by huge amounts. It can spill off those ranges and those mountainsides in 4 different directions, sometimes even 20 different directions, because each time it comes down and it hits another ridge line, it expands and breaks into further ravines, and that increases and focuses the water pressure and the speed that it travels. As long as that material doesn't hit more Lantana and set up underneath, stop underneath Lantana, where it'll be suppressed by the allelopathic nature of the plant and wait to be flushed out of there further downstream. So this is like a shotgun effect. It explodes it across the surface, and when it hits new areas that aren't infested, it then has that ability to be able to expand really quickly. And then we've got 1 year to have killed that plant before it becomes productive. And as a minimum, it's putting out 400 plants. Every plant you see in the pictures on my video, which I'll put in between these things, you will see a plant that is expanding at 400 plants per plant as the minimum. But most of those plants in those watercourses that your Premier is allowing to grow on National Parks lands is expanding at 3,600 plants per plant. And this is something we better get our heads around. By 2020, all of the grazing leases will cease to exist within national parks and the state forests. You have a look at the state of those affairs in those photos that I have in this film, and you will have your answers as to what the future looks like in 2020. All monies will cease coming into the national parks. So the little bit of money that once upon a time with the grazing leases, the national parks paid for this work. But the government started to see them as a place to rip those monies out of there and spend those monies to prop up the government and to try and win elections. We have a world of hurt in the next lot of elections, in the next lot of 10 years, 9 years, that we have some terrible choices to make, and they're all caused by our current premiers and prime ministers and the ones before, but more these ones here. Once we kick people out of places that they access and enjoy, they won't allow money to be spent on the protection of those places. So what is the future for any of our national parks? They are already a complete cesspool of lantana. We are never going to clean those national parks out, because the cost to do it would just be not worth doing. So all those people are saying we want the little birdies to stay and we want the lantana to stay for those little birdies, and the bell minor birds are destroying the forest and killing the gum trees, killing the eucalypts. See, they don't have to justify any of their positions. They just say, well, you know, we don't want to upset any little birdies or anything else that might use lantana. But the reality is, there is no questioning of what they're saying to you is the reality. And it's so far from any reality we know. 14 million hectares. We don't get to be precious about this. When we start to take on this problem as a capital works program, and the nation will need to do that, either that or every single person in this country that owns land is going to have to deal with lantana themselves. This problem is that big, caused by our government's lies and deceit within this situation, breaking the laws knowingly and willfully, that we now are out of options. We have to create a capital works program, and we have to be smashing 6 million hectares of lantana a year. And we'll probably have to get up to 10 million hectares of lantana a year before we reach the critical mass of the expansion rate of the material. And then that will only buy us the time to then go, okay, we've stopped the expansion at this point. Now we've got to decide how we go about the rest of it. But when we mobilise all of the public, all of the people who own land, all of the people who have an interest in this, which would be every single person with a child, this is their future. This is the whole economy of our nation. This isn't something trivial and something we don't have to worry about. Our choices from this point on are massive. I keep saying it. Farmers are never, ever going to be able to survive the expansion rate of this material pouring back out of the national parks. And we're going to have to stop this garbage with the fire breaks and all of the fire stuff, fire management. That money has not been spent on that in 20 years by the governments. They've not spent the money on these things. You know, we are going to see people get trapped in areas where roads don't go anywhere anymore, where they are completely overgrown. That's general public are trying to drive down places that you used to be able to access that are completely cannot go there anymore. Now, the fuel load that it takes to stop you from going somewhere is a fuel load that is critically deadly to you. And we have people who live around these national parks having to fight fires within those national parks, whether they are skilled or not skilled or skilled enough. We are going to see fatalities. We are going to see families decimated by what happens with these consequences of our government. And it's up to us to stop the government. They've proven they're not trustworthy. They've proven they won't tell you the truth. They leave lantana growing where it's illegal to leave it growing. Well, it's illegal to leave it growing at all. Biosecurity says that. So we've got to find out, does biosecurity enforce these things? Did the Biosecurity Act correctly in allowing the councils to write their own plans? Because they're now saying, well, we have to prove that the council either knew or didn't know. Well, hold on a minute. Somebody was supposed to be trained in this. They should be able to back up whether what their decisions were correct or not. Now you see the lantana floats, the seeds float. You cannot have lantana growing in watercourses, can you? Logically, people already get that. So how the hell are the councils allowing this to grow in every floodway, every waterway, every drainage ditch around our nation? How is that happening? It is illegal. Why are we tolerating it? Councils must represent our needs and our desires. That's what they were put there for. They were never put there to be in bed with the state government and doing deals with the state government at our expense, at our ecology's expense, at our economy. These documents say this. This is all written from government departments saying this is the situation. So how are they supposedly circumventing this? These are the questions in 2019 we will be answering in the huge numbers of community meetings we'll be holding with councils as we go after the state government. And the councils have no other option. You either go out there and get the funding from the state government, or you come back to us after 2 or 3 attempts, and I want 2 or 3 attempts, and you show us what you were told by the state government, and then we will take that up with the state government and the federal government. These things cannot be tolerated because the cost to the economy and to the people of the nation, through the cost to the fauna and flora, are ones we cannot be putting on the bank card anymore. We can't be pretending that something will come somewhere else further down the track. It doesn't exist. There are no magic pills. Poisoning doesn't work. Poisoning can only be utilised 2 to 3 months of the year. And in some of this footage, you'll see plants that were poisoned, that weren't poisoned correctly, and have now bounced back. Now, each one of those plants has the potential to then cross-pollinate to other plants and pass on that resistance to those poisons to the other plants. This is what's happening in our biological control, okay, our biological side of these things. The government hasn't told you anything about how big a mistake and how big a cock-ups they've made. There will not be a biological control to this material. It won't be. They keep alluding to it somewhere along the line, but every one of them that they've released has had terrible, terrible, terrible side effects. And we're now losing bushland to the cures they put out there. And now it's accepted, when you talk amongst these groups off camera, that there is no biological control and there is no chance of a biological control because they have no idea of the genus of these plants. And why should we spend billions of dollars trying to pull a genie out of the pocket and a magic pill that has the potential to catastrophically destroy much of our ecology? If we're going to do that, we need to remove all protection from prosecution for the government and also for the scientists that come up with the cure. Because if you get it wrong, you must be prosecuted to massive amounts for the cost. Look at the cane toads, look at the foxes, look at everything else that they've released along these lines and what the consequence to our ecology and our nature has been. Anyway, sit back, have a look at a few of the photos, and I'll catch you on the next video. Thanks for watching. Happy New Year 2019 to everybody, and I hope it's a fantastic year. And I look forward to reversing all of these things with the state government and the councils. And I look forward to seeing each and every one of you at the council meetings across our nation. It's time we got very serious. So give to our cause and support our cause by turning out in these community meetings, because the councils will roll over very quickly. The councils cannot afford for us to start to uncover exactly how corrupt they are with the state government in not asking for funding to protect our assets. This is our country. This isn't Anastasia Palaszczuk's country. This isn't Scott Morrison's country. This isn't the New South Wales Premier's country. This is ours. And these people work for us, but they've forgotten that. There's no accountability in them even operating legally. So we need to sort those things out. And the best way is straight through the councils. We'll go through the Lockyer Valley, through Fernvale, through Dundas, through Mount Mee, through all of these places in Moreton Bay Regional Council, Logan, okay? Because that flood that has come from the Toowoomba Range, that is through the Lockyer Valley already, Boona is just a stone's throw from that flood that's coming. And I said that in that Scenic Room Council. You guys have no idea what's coming, what's just outside of your border already. and what is going to come flooding through there. So the levels of infestations we have in those areas already are nothing to what's coming. And all because of the road systems and the access to the water from those road systems, the access to the animal life and water into the waterways, and then from the waterways lifted to the tops of the ranges and the hillsides. And because the national parks are such cesspools, completely inundated with that material, and absolutely zero operations in it. Look at what's pouring out at Dundas and Mount Glorious and the Dáguilar National Park. There's your living proof. And that material, via Google Earth, is running all the way down to the Enoggera Reserve. Okay? Down at Enoggera, all the way from there, all the way down through there, and thousands of kilometres to the north and thousands of kilometres to the south, all the way to the Victorian border and all the way to the Daintree. We have to start holding these people accountable. And they must be accountable, they must be. There's no way in the wide world they can't be. Just nobody's ever stood up to them. But the consequence of the films you see, and then the expansion rate of these things living in watercourses, and pretty soon the cattle will be out of there. 2 years is no time. The cattle will be out of there, and all brakes are off. There is no holding this stuff back from that point on. These are facts. These aren't my opinions. They're actually cold, hard facts of how this is going to play out in the future. So it's horrific now, but it is nothing to what it's going to be shortly. Anyway, look, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. Happy New Year, and I'll catch you on the next one. I'm Gary, 0449 986 880, lantanaremovalqueensland.com.au, and Lantana Removal Queensland group on Facebook, and Lantana Removal Queensland on Facebook. So check in with us, say g'day, take your snaps of all of the Lantana where you run into it, where you can't go down any more roads, or where it's on the sides of those roads, in those watercourses, and send them in. Until the Premier and these people start to see you sending material in and you writing to these people, they are not going to take you seriously. They take me seriously, but they don't like me. But I don't have to be liked. This cannot be passed on to our children. It cannot be passed on. The wildlife cannot possibly pay for this anymore, and neither can our ecology, our flora. We cannot possibly turn our back on this stuff. We will fight this war. It just is a choice of when we step into it as to how much it costs us. Anyway, thank you all for taking the time. Catch us next time. What amazes me about making these videos for you guys is showing you the different areas and different infestation levels that all are illegal. This is all National Parks lands. This is state government, state forest lands to the left of this, up through that range there. And it's illegal for them to allow this material to grow here. But see how this material becomes one complete thicket? At this point in time, the only thing that's keeping any thoroughfare between these plants is actually the cattle pushing their way through it. And what was proven in North Queensland is when fires came along, the cattle won't push through Lantana. Once they lose their bearings and they don't know where they are in this stuff, they'll nose into it, then that's it. They'll back out and they are stuck and they die. So you see these infestations here, and every one of these clumps, every one of these plants you see has a value of 400 new plants this year, or 3,600 plants this year. Every single one of these. See the little thoroughfares closing over? The cattle are using them less and less, becoming less and less effective. Eventually they just give up and they move on. The same as all of the natural Australian wildlife, they already have moved on. But eventually these systems are completely closed over. This is 20 odd kilometres of this waterway running through this landscape of the national parks, winding backwards and forwards from one side of the road to the other. And all of it is like this. Some of it down further when I go up a bit higher here. Look at the seeds on these bushes here when I come in really close. And you get an idea of how many of these seeds are being dumped into that watercourse there. And then propagating across the road and down through the watercourse further. It just is an endless escalation.
And that's why the Biosecurity Act of 2014 says it can't be released to the environment. The Premier knows this and is operating illegally. So what is the future? Anyway, thank you for watching. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.